Thank you, my lord. Just before I start on my submissions again, I've tried to do some archaeology on the bundle in order to identify what I hope is the answer to the question that I think my Lord Briggs asked about the payment obligations in relation to the documents between the contracts. And the answer is inevitably that it doesn't work quite as well as one would have hoped it does, because the documents don't match up precisely with what the evidence is, but I'll do my best so you can see where it is. And I think one can understand where the parties were going.
If it's long and complicated and it would take you out of your course, I don't mind having it on.
It'll take me 2 minutes,
okay.
I think. So the first place one starts is with the witness statement of Mr. Bailey, who tells us, that's at tab 21, page 201, I think.
Sorry, tab 21 of...
Tab 21 of Appendix Part 2.
Which is the very bundle that doesn't have tabs
Yes.
for me, I'm afraid. So, and I'm working on the hard copy, so I'm so sorry, Mr.
Not at all.
It's the page number.
It's page 443 to 444.
Thank you very much.
No, 201, my lord.
201.
Oh, sorry, MS 443.
My lord doesn't have MSs, so it's 201.
Page 201.
Bottom middle of the page.
Great.
MS 443.
Thank you very much.
Yes. And over the leaf at paragraph 6, one sees that he says that they had an online business account. That's what we're told.
I'm sorry, paragraph?
6. Page
Page.
444.
444, MS 444. That's the 200 is the paper page.
Okay.
One's at paragraph 444, page 444, that's
Yep.
Yep. So he just tells us there's an online business account. So that's the starting point. They had some sort of business account. One then goes to MS 701, which is page 499, I think.
Thank you.
Yep.
459. 459. One sees the bulk mail general terms and conditions that one looked at paragraph 3 this morning, and it has various different appendices. You'll remember it made reference to an appendix in paragraph 3.1.
Yeah.
The MS 701, page 459 of the, yep. And the nearest one gets to the online business account, I think, is the credit account. And the credit account in paragraph 14 says Royal Mail shall send the customer weekly invoices, and the customer shall pay such invoices in due by the payment date as set out in the invoice. But the invoices we have, which I showed you one this morning, which was in which was at page MS 409, page 167 of that bundle. In fact, offered 30 days. So the best one can do is to say that clause 3 was expecting to pay in accordance with the appendix. Paragraph 3 was requiring payment in accordance with the appendix. The appendices are these 4 appendices with these various different types of accounts. The credit account is probably the account that Zipvit had, and you paid against an invoice within 30 days. So whatever was left outstanding, there would have to be an invoice raised, and Zipvit would then pay against that.
Well, it says the terms are 30 days, but at the bottom it says you've elected to pay by direct debit. We'll debit your account on the same day as the invoice.
In which case, that was... Yes.
But I'm not sure much turns on that.
No, I think not. I sincerely hope not. But there is also a credit account where what one does is simply to add cash sometimes, or alternatively.
It's the invoice date's the 5th of July and it's paid by the 4th of August.
Oh, it's payable by the 4th of August.
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
apologise.
We will debit your
yes.
account on the 4th of August, so it's the 5th.
So it's 30 days.
On the electronic page, I haven't seen the date of the invoice. There it is at the top. Thank you. So you have got your 30 days.
Yes.
Thank you.
So there we are. where we were was about to arrive at the Court of Appeal's analysis of Barlis. And this is at page 166 of the electronic bundle. It's tab 8 of the core bundle, page 163 onwards. And he analyses Barlis at that stage. And eventually in paragraph 114, he arrives at his conclusion.
So about 108.
If you would like me to, can I direct you back to paragraph 108? My learned friend has asked me to draw your attention to that. So there are different kinds of defects. Yes, we accept there are different kinds of defects. And what the learned judge says is Zipvit is therefore claiming to be entitled to exercise its right to deduct without being able to produce either a compliant VAT invoice or supplementary information which shows the conditions of Article 2, 2, 6, 9 and 10 are satisfied, that is, details of the VAT rate applied and the VAT amount payable coupled with evidence of payment of that amount by Royal Mail. To which we say, well, as far as the first ones are concerned, we know what the VAT rate was, because we've told you the VAT rate which is applicable is 20%. It may not be what the invoice says, but that's the correction that has to be run. And working out how much the VAT payable is merely a question of applying Section 26A and Article 90 to the amount which is actually paid. Those cater for those issues. And then he says, coupled with evidence of payment of that amount by Royal Mail, i.e. payment of that amount by Royal Mail to the commissioners. And then he goes on with discussion of what Advocate General Cocotte says, which I'm not going to trouble you with at the moment. And then at paragraph 112, at the bottom of page 169, he says, properly understood, the decision of the court in Barlis appears to me to expose a fatal flaw in Zipvit's case. One of the main purposes of the mandatory requirement of VAT invoice is to enable the taxing authorities to monitor payment by the supplier for the tax for which a deduction is sought. Or, as the Advocate General put it, to enable a check on whether the person issuing the invoice has paid the tax. Zipvit remains wholly unable to satisfy this condition because the only invoices which it can supply show the complete opposite, namely that no tax was paid because the supplies were considered to be exempt. Nor can it be said the position is remedied by the exiguous further information supplied with the letter of claim. All that did was to show the VAT component of the original purchase prices on the assumption that our supplies were taxable. Well, of course, these supplies were taxable, and it therefore shows what the VAT component is. It provided no evidence, and this is his real point, that a penny of tax has been paid by Royal Mail to HMRC. Still less so that it did so in the form of an invoice issued by Royal Mail. And then at 114, he goes on to deal with the formal as opposed to substantive point. And he says, I fail to see how Zipvit could hope to circumvent this fundamental difficulty by arguing that the requirement for a compliant VAT invoice is one of form rather than substance, and by invoking the discretion which HMRC have to accept alternative evidence under Reg 29.2. It's true that as Barlis and a number of other cases which we've shown consistently draw a distinction between substantive conditions and formal conditions. But to describe a requirement as formal does not necessarily imply that compliance is optional, or that a failure to satisfy it is always capable of being excused. The court was careful in Barlis to confine its discussion to the requirements in Articles 226 and 7. And I do not think its reasoning can be extended to cover a failure to comply with a fundamental requirement relating to the payment of the relevant tax in 226, 9 and 10. Provision of invoice which complies with those requirements is essential to the proper performance by HMRC of their monitoring functions in relation to VAT, and is needed as evidence that the supplier has duly paid or accounted for the tax to HMRC. But with the greatest respect to the learned Lord Justice Henderson, that involves a logical fallacy. An invoice never proves that tax has been paid to a fiscal authority. What it does is to enable the commissioners, when a claim for input tax recovery is made, to ask the claimant to identify the invoice which supports the claim, and then taking that invoice, go to the supplier and check that the supplier has indeed accounted for tax in relation to that supply to HMRC. Now, of course, in this particular case, Zipvit had the original invoices of which you have seen a copy, and in relation to which it was agreed the VAT treatment was wrong. Zipvit had also written to the Commissioner's officer explaining the position in accordance with the business brief that the Commissioners had published. And armed with that information and knowledge of the operation of the decision of the Court of Justice in TNT, it was entirely open to the Commissioners to go to Royal Mail and demand that they comply with the decision of the Court of Justice and pay the appropriate amount of VAT. That is what the Court of Justice in Barlis was expecting people to do. What a VAT invoice can never do is to prove that a supplier has discharged his VAT liability to the commissioners.
But it can be of use to the revenue authorities in checking whether or not the supplier's accounting has properly been done.
Oh, absolutely. And we say...
It clearly has a role to play there.
Indeed. And the invoices that had been raised by Royal Mail, which identified the nature of the supplies and the time they were made and the amounts involved, did more than enough, coupled with the explanation that was given by Zipvit to the commissioners, to say, now you know what the position is. Go and ask Royal Mail what it wants to do. And as we know, paragraph 60 of Paper Consult specifically rejects that the proposition that the customer has to be able to demonstrate that tax has been paid into the public purse.
It's a theme that appears repeatedly in the Court of Appeal's judgment that it has to be demonstrated that it has been paid. It's there again at paragraph 117, isn't it?
And my submission is that wherever it appears, it's wrong. Because Bonnick demonstrates that one is entitled to recover one's input tax before tax has been paid. It is not a condition of the right to deduct input tax that payment be made, or indeed that the tax be paid by the supplier to the tax authorities. To elevate it into a precondition to the recovery of input tax in this particular case was, with my greatest respect, wholly wrong.
Well, the section speaks of due or paid, and it's enough if it were due.
Due or payable.
Due or paid.
Due or paid.
Due or paid, I think.
Yes.
If the revenue did go to Royal Mail, well, I suppose the time might matter, but after TNT and said, you've been treating these supplies as exempt, in fact you should be treating them as standard rated, would it then have been open to Royal Mail to have brought a contract claim against?
Yes, I think it would. Because if you look at the times that we were dealing with,
right,
whatever the limitation periods were, it was within 6 years.
And so that now, am I right in thinking that now wouldn't be available to Royal Mail because the domestic law limitation period for a contract claim has expired? Is that right?
That I would hesitate to say. My knowledge of domestic contract limitation periods is limited in the extreme.
I think there is
6
a
years.
provision in the.
It's normally
Limitation
6
Act
years, but
excluding
6
the
years
revenue
from the demand
the
rules.
scope of those limits. It wouldn't be the Limitation Act. It would be a revenue statute itself if there were relevant limitations.
And no,
Royal
given that
Mail
we are
subject.
dealing with consideration, my lord, and this is part of the consideration, one's looking at contractual consideration.
But this is whether the revenue could go back to Royal
if
Mail
one-
to make the demand.
Well, that's a different point. The question when the revenue's right to recover from the Royal Mail is concerned was certainly dictated by Section 77 of the VAT Act,
Yeah.
which is a 4-year period. And it would be a 4-year period generally from the time of supply, though there are certain exceptions at the general rule.
So you were looking at whether Royal Mail could go against Zipvit.
That was my
Sorry,
Lord
I apologise.
Sales question.
That would normally be 6 years from when the cause of action accrued.
Yes,
As you've heard, I've been fossicking around to try and find out when the cause of action did accrue.
yes. And I confess that I couldn't simply say at the moment that it was only against a demand or from the time that the contract was entered into and the supplies were made.
Okay.
What in my respect for submission is very important to understand about Barlis, and where I think the Lord Justice Henderson failed to appreciate, is that a lot of what was said in Barlis goes to the first question which was asked, which was whether Article 226 was failed. And paragraph 27, which is one of the paragraphs on which Lord Justice Henderson relied, which is at page 901, this is the monitoring activity. It's can you tell me what it is? Barlis, my lord, is at tab 20.
Yeah.
And we're looking at paragraph 27 of the decision.
Yes, thank you.
And that's what Lord Justice Henderson picks up on. But that appears in the first part of the question, which is there a failure to satisfy Article 226? It doesn't appear in the second part of the question, which starts at paragraph 36 onwards.
Which is the paragraph in Lord Justice Henderson's judgment? Oh, it's here. It's 105.
Thank you.
So 112 is the direct ref.
112 as well. Yeah.
But you presumably say that the original invoices, once submitted by Zipvit to the revenue, would give the revenue everything they need to monitor, because they show the payment of a price, and identify the price, for a taxable supply between two taxable persons.
And they identify the date at which the supply took place,
Yeah.
which of course gives you the rate of VAT which
Yeah.
is appropriate.
And then they can go back and say, well, hold on, we all know this is
Wrong.
We've been told by the European Court this is a taxable supply. We can overlook the mistake in the invoice that says it's either zero rated or exempt. And now we want to know whether you've accounted.
So one does have, in my respect for submission, sufficient proof of the satisfaction of the substantive conditions. And what is the complaint which is being made is, well, these fail the formal conditions. And some formal conditions, says Lord Justice Henderson, seem to be more substantive than others.
And that's all dependent upon your submission, that even in a case where the parties provided that the payment is exclusive of VAT, with a formula for recovery of the VAT later which isn't implemented, nonetheless there's a taxable supply and there's a price, and therefore VAT is due.
And what is more, the price which was identified in the invoice, being the only price which was ever
Yes.
demanded, is precisely the right amount,
And then you net down to
Yeah.
find out what the
which is what's
true consideration is.
Yes.
And can I ask, what did in fact happen as between the Revenue and Royal Mail? So we get TNT and the position becomes clear.
We aren't in a position to say, but what I would say, and is that we drew conclusions from the way in which the Revenue ran their argument in the first-tier tribunal, because the argument of the revenue in the first-tier tribunal was that these supplies were still exempt as a matter of domestic law, even though they were standard rated as a matter of European law. And Judge Mosedale decided against the commissioners and said, no, you can mar-lease these provisions in the VAT Act. And as a result, these were taxable supplies both from a domestic position and from a European position. Now, taking that into account, one's assumed that if the commissioners are saying these were still exempt as a matter of domestic law, as they were at that time, one conclusion from that was reasonably that no tax had been collected and the revenue hadn't gone against. But Zipvit is not in a position to give any detailed information as to exactly how those were behaved, but we assume that that was the way in which matters proceeded.
Thank you very much.
So my submission on paragraph 27, which is the paragraph on which Lord Justice Henderson relies, is, well, that was addressing the wrong question. And the second question is the question which is paragraph 36 onwards. And in those circumstances, these ought to, the failures of the invoices ought to have been waived, having regard to the other information available. Now, 2 weeks before the Court of Justice...
Sorry, just on paragraph 27.
Yes.
The court does seem to endorse the view of the Advocate General that part of the objective is allowing the tax authorities to monitor payments.
Oh, absolutely. And one accepts that.
And what issue did points 30, 32 and 46 of her opinion address?
Can I, my learned friend will take you to those points in due course.
All right.
It's part of his case, not my case. I simply say that goes to the extent that those are issues which are raised by Advocate General Cocotte.
All right. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. They only go to the first question.
As regards the revenue's position vis-à-vis Royal Mail, is it not an agreed position that the revenue felt they could not go against Royal Mail because of they created a legitimate expectation?
No, it's not agreed.
That's not agreed.
No, it's definitely not agreed. It's agreed that they didn't go against Royal Mail, but it's not agreed what the reason was why they didn't go against Royal Mail, because that would not be for Zipvit to be able to say. And I'll come back to that in my reply. So the next case to which I would take you, my lord, is a case called Dobre, which is in the supplementary bundle, the first supplementary bundle that you have. It's one of these.
Not the additional.
The light blue supplementary bundle.
Is this in the main memory stick?
No, it never got onto the electronic bundle.
Has it been sent in as...
It was sent in, there should be two supplementary bundles, one in white, which the commissioners, and one...
But have they been sent in electronically?
Yes,
No.
Yes, they have.
But they're not numbered electronically, are they?
I would have to check. Well, it's certainly...
I don't think they've been added to the main electronic...
163, which means the numbers will be the same as the numbers in this document.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
You don't need two numbers.
Oh. Dobre is to be found at tab 6 in this bundle.
So page 24.
Oh, yes, I've got it.
And Mr. Dobre had his identification for VAT purposes revoked by reason of his failure to file VAT returns. And one sees at paragraph 18 that despite that, this is page 28, he continued to issue invoices including VAT without submitting the relevant VAT returns. He then suffers a VAT inspection which results in an assessment to output tax, and he claims an input tax deduction which is rejected by the authorities not because his VAT invoices were defective, but because he wasn't registered with VAT at the relevant time. One sees the rejection at paragraphs 20 to 21. Now, the domestic court referred the question whether it was open to the state to demand VAT from an unregistered trader without giving him an input tax deduction, which is to be found at paragraph 27. And then the Court of Justice cites the usual paragraphs from paper consult. And then at paragraph 35, says the position could be different if the effective breach of failure to satisfy formal requirements is to prevent the production of conclusive evidence that the substantive requirements have been satisfied. Refusal of the right to deduct depends more on the lack of information necessary to establish that the substantive conditions have been satisfied than it does on failure to comply with a formal requirement. See to that effect the judgment of IDEX Laboratories. And similarly, paragraph 36, the right to deduct may be refused if it has been established in light of objective evidence that the right is being invoked fraudulently or abusively. And it's that reference to IDEX Laboratories that I want to pick up, because IDEX is at the previous tab 5. And this was another reverse charge case like EcoTrade, where the taxpayer had failed to record his acquisitions from another member state by recording the relevant invoices in a VAT register, treating them instead as VAT exempt. And one sees that at paragraphs 14 to 16 on page 19. Then at paragraph 29, the court identifies the questions asked by the referring court. In essence, whether or not the relevant provisions of the directive must be interpreted as containing formal requirements relating to the right to deduct, or by contrast, as containing substantive requirements governing that right, failure to comply with which in circumstances such as those in issue in the main proceedings would result in the loss of that right. Then at paragraph 41 on page 22, it defines what substantive conditions are. Substantive requirements for the right to deduct are those governing the actual substance and scope of the right, as provided for in Article 17 of the 6th Directive, which is now Article 168 of the Principal VAT Directive. And then paragraph 42, the formal requirements for that right, by contrast, regulate the rules governing its excise and monitoring thereof and the smooth functioning of the VAT system, such as the obligations relating to accounting, invoicing and filing returns. Those are set out in what were then 18 to 22 of the 6th Directive and are Articles 178 onwards of the Principal VAT Directive. 43, so far as concerns taxable intra-community acquisitions, substantive requirements stipulate that the acquisitions have been effected in that particular way. And 44, it's apparent from the order for reference that in the case in the main proceedings, the agencia has all the information necessary to establish those substantive requirements have been satisfied. Accordingly, paragraph 45, it follows from all the foregoing considerations the right referred to in Article 17.2d of the directive, which is what was then in play, to deduct the VAT payable, cannot be denied to IDEX on the ground that it did not satisfy the formal requirements laid down by national law in implementation of Article 18.1d. That right to deduct arises in accordance with Article 17.1 at the time when the deductible tax becomes chargeable. So, again, one finds that Dobre and IDEX are reaffirming this substance over form division between formal requirements and substantive requirements. So what we have is a crossover between the import acquisition cases and the import tax deduction cases on supply when Dobre brings IDEX into play as an authority for treating the failure to conform to the formal requirements as potentially causing a lack of information, which can then be remedied by the claimant providing alternative forms of evidence. So those authorities, coupled with the ones that one has already seen, and coupled with one final authority, which is Verdun, provide in my submission very substantial authority that it doesn't matter what the formal failure is. The only question the court should be concerned with is whether that jeopardizes the existence of sufficient information and evidence of satisfaction of the substantive conditions. And what is very clear in my submission is it matters whether, not at all, whether the conditions have been laid down by the directive or by the member state under power conferred on it by the directive. In each case, the rules are formal conditions only and must give way when there is proof that the substantive conditions for input tax deduction and recovery have been satisfied. And my final case in this area is Verdun, which is at page 1115, tab 34 of the primary bundle of authorities. We can pick it up at 1121, I think. What had happened was that the taxpayer had constructed a residential complex and carried out numerous property transactions in relation to which he claimed not to be a taxable person and in which he collected no VAT from his purchasers. Then 10 years later, this is 1121, is
Which paragraph?
evident, the facts. 10 years later, he was assessed to output tax and sought to reduce his output tax exposure by a claim for input tax. And one sees that at paragraph 30, the referring court indicates what the basis was. And at 31, the question it asked is whether the application of the principle of VAT neutrality enables the exercise of the right of deduction when in circumstances such as those of the main proceedings, in which in particular the issue of invoices was not compulsory at that time, the taxable person is unable to produce invoices, and whether or not the principle of proportionality produces a measure restricting the right to deduct VAT in those circumstances. Now, if Lord Justice Henderson were right that the absence of any invoices whatsoever was a complete block on the right to deduct input tax, the answer of the Court of Justice would have been very short indeed and would simply have been, since Mr. Verdun didn't have any invoices at all, his failure to comply with Article 226 was absolute, and that was the end of the matter. Now, I'm going to invite you to start with the opinion of Advocate General Tanshev at page 1124, which is page 265, my lord. And you'll see that paragraph 1, he starts with the proposition that a properly drawn up invoice has been termed the ticket of admission to the right of deduction, given that it has an insurance function for the National Fiscal Authority in linking input tax deduction to the payment of tax. And that he obtains from a case called Jerian, many years ago. Gernon. Now, what the Advocate General eventually decides, in fact, that a taxable person who does not hold invoices attesting to his right to deduct VAT cannot provide proof of the transactions if all he's got going for him is a report established by court-appointed authorities. Paragraph 5, he refers to all the authorities that have so far been decided, and he says, well, they're all dealing with defective invoices and limitation periods, and that this case, Verdun, could decide whether or not that approach also applies where the taxable person fails to supply any invoices at all. And if one then skips to the end of his opinion, page 1136, which is page 277 of the hard bundle, paragraphs 80 to 81.
Let's read 77.
277.
No, 77.
77?
Paragraph 77.
Oh, sorry. Could I invite you to read paragraph 77? My learned friend would like you to read that. And then if we go to paragraphs 80 to 81, he gives his reasons why the absence of any sort of invoice was conclusive in the specific case in front of him. It was not failure to comply with a formal requirement. It was lack of information that the substantive requirements have been satisfied. So the Advocate General is saying it's not in every case that a defective or absent invoice prevents the right to deduct from being exercised, but only, as he goes on to say in the next sentence, where the infringement of formal requirements is so great that it makes it impossible or overly difficult to ascertain whether the substantive conditions for entitlement for deduction have been met. And he refers in the footnote at the bottom of the page, paragraph 64, to Advocate General Mengozzi in Paper Consult, and also the decision of the Court of Justice in Dobre, which you've just seen, which he also refers to, I notice, at footnote 66 as well. So his conclusion is, thus the main proceedings reflect one of the two exceptions to the prevalence of substance over form, the other being participation in tax avoidance evasion. Therefore, while it cannot be excluded, circumstances might arise in which the substantive conditions for deduction of input tax might be ascertainable by reference to expert reports in the absence of invoices, a question which it would be for the referring court to decide. Such circumstances did not arise, in my view, in the main proceedings. And then he explains why. He goes on to say in paragraph 83, just over the page, that the facts arising in the main proceedings are distinguishable from the recent ruling of the court in Volkswagen on several bases, most notably due to the fact there was no lack of due diligence on the part of the applicant in that case, and there was no doubt the applicant had a right to deduct input tax, the sum being quantifiable by late invoicing, but quantifiable. Similarly, input tax was held to be deductible in VIOSAFE because it was objectively impossible for the taxable person to exercise its right to deduct before a VAT adjustment was made by another taxable person in the chain of supply. So those are two cases which will come into prominence in my learned friend's reply. And then he goes on to say, above all, there is nothing in the case filed before the court to suggest that in light of a 10-year lapse of time and the lack of any invoices or usable equivalent documents, an expert report could accurately re-record each relevant transaction with respect to which deduction of input tax is claimed. And that's the problem. An absence of evidence, not a failure to satisfy formal requirements. And the court adopted the same approach at page 1122, or page 263, my lord. Electronic 1122.
Thank you so much.
Paragraph 39 onwards. Paragraphs 39 and 40, the usual reference to the need to comply with substantive conditions and the explanation that Article 226 is a formal condition. Then paragraphs 41 and 42 emphasize that the fundamental principles of neutrality and proportionality of VAT demand a deduction if the substantive requirements have been satisfied. And that the strict application of, and this should be the strict application of the formal requirement to produce invoices in paragraph 42, would conflict with the principles of neutrality and proportionality, inasmuch as it would disproportionately prevent the taxable person from benefiting from fiscal neutrality relating to his transactions. So it's an unfortunate slip on the part of the court, but nevertheless it's perfectly clear it means formal conditions. So it's up for the taxable person to prove his position, and accordingly the taxable person is required to provide objective evidence that goods and services were actually provided as inputs by taxable persons for the purposes of own transactions subject to VAT, in respect of which he has actually paid VAT. Now I'll come back to that. And that evidence may include documents held by suppliers or service providers from whom the taxable person has acquired the goods or services. An assessment based on an expert report commissioned by a national court may, if necessary, supplement that evidence or reinforce its credibility, but may not replace it. But fundamentally, what was missing in Vadin was any invoices whatsoever. He had till receipts, and his till receipts were illegible. The transactions had taken place 10 years before. And the problem that Vadin therefore faced was that he simply couldn't identify the value or nature of any of the supplies in relation to which he was seeking an input tax deduction. It was an utter lack of information. But what one does draw from Vadin, that there is no need to have a tax invoice. That's paragraph 42. You can prove it by a different means. Now, with that, one can go back to the domestic provisions and Regulation 29 of the VAT regulations, which is at page 884 and in the Primary Authority Bundle, tab 10. Paragraph 29 says, save as the Commissioners may otherwise allow or direct, either generally or specially, a person claiming deduction of input tax under section 25(2) shall do so on a return made by him for the prescribed accounting period in which the VAT becomes chargeable, save that where he does not at that time hold the document or invoice required by paragraph 2 below, he shall make his claim on the return for the first prescribed accounting period in which he holds that document or invoice. And then down to 2, at the time of claiming deduction of input tax in accordance with paragraph 1 above, a person shall, if the claim is in respect of a supply from another taxable person, hold the document which is required to be provided under Regulation 13. Well, that's a VAT invoice. And then at the very end of that paragraph, provided that where the Commissioners so direct either generally or in relation to particular cases or classes of case, a claimant shall hold or provide such other evidence of the charge to VAT as the Commissioners may direct. Now, in this particular Commissioner's case, the Commissioners rejected the claim on the basis that Zipvit did not hold valid VAT invoices, although it provided the invoices that it did have. But the decisions of the Court of Justice, in my submission, sufficiently clearly indicate that it is not open to the Commissioners to adhere to that rule if proof of the satisfaction of the substantive conditions is otherwise provided. And so in my submission, if necessary, one has to read into Regulation 29 just such a limitation on its absolute nature. And it then becomes not a question of whether the Commissioners have a discretion or not to accept or reject alternative evidence, but a question of whether the evidence which has been provided or held by the taxpayer meets the requirement of being evidence of the charge to tax. And I say in European terms, Reg 29 is merely a formal requirement, and that in the circumstances, the Court of Appeal ought to have concluded that Zipvit had done enough to warrant its claim for input tax being allowed. The evidence that was before the first-tier tribunal was adequate. The elements we were missing were only the VAT characterisation and the rate of VAT, both of which were known and neither of which could be denied. And the Commissioner's rejection of their claims when asked to exercise their discretion was, well, these supplies are still exempt at domestic law, even if they were standard rated under the directive. Once that was disposed of and agreed, there can be no doubt that Zipvit paid consideration in relation to the relevant supplies, which were taxable supplies, whose nature, date, and value is identified in the invoices which were raised, and of which you've seen a copy or an example. And in those circumstances, it's my submission that the principles of fiscal neutrality and proportionality require that Zipvit be permitted to exercise its fundamental right to deduct.
Would I be right that if there were a chain of supply which did have an exempt supply within it, then the principle of fiscal neutrality wouldn't necessarily work, because VAT would be, input VAT would be lost by the supplier that made the exempt supply, and the ultimate customer would pay the full whack of VAT on top.
What actually happens, of course, is that you get what's known as blocking VAT.
Yes.
And inevitably in those circumstances, what then goes on is that gets built into the price further down the line.
Yes.
But a person making an exempt supply is generally treated as being put into the position of a final consumer.
Yes, well quite. But
Yeah.
I mean, what we're dealing with here then is a situation where Royal Mail, we know, built into their price what they believed was the cost of the lost input tax, 2.5%.
Yes.
And one can assume Zipvit, similarly, having received an exempt supply, would do something similar.
Yes.
So you may be right, but in a sense, Zipvit is getting a windfall because it has built in to its sale price the input VAT it can't recover, and then is recovering it from HMRC.
Or alternatively, one could say that it is only to the extent of that 2.5% that it's received an extra amount from its customer that otherwise would not have been necessary to pay. The problem one gets, and it's something which comes out of a case to which my learned friend has lately added into his bundle, which is the ITC case, where at paragraph 59, Lord Reed says, well, where you've got a chain of suppliers, precisely where the economic burden falls is almost impossible to identify. And it's best to avoid it and move on, because one simply can't see without huge amounts of economic evidence, and even if one's got economic evidence from experts, one still can't be absolutely certain that prices have actually been suffered by A rather than B. It doesn't necessarily follow that because Zipvit was left with an additional sum of 2.5, which it was unable to recover as input tax, whatever it might be, that it was able to build the whole of that additional sum into the price it charged to its final
Obviously, we
consumer.
don't know.
Yes.
None of that is before us, but I was just trying to understand where there is an exempt supply in what would otherwise be a supply chain leading to a final consumer, then conceptually you treat the exempt, the maker of the exempt supply as the final consumer,
Yes.
and start again.
Yes, yes.
But
Yes.
in reality, if it is a component of a wider chain of supply, then the principle of fiscal neutrality is breached in that context.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
I can very briefly show you what it was that Zipvit did when it was making its claim. What it did was to write to the commissioners making 2 voluntary disclosure letters in relation to under-recovered input tax. And it then entered into correspondence with the commissioner's officer as to what it needed to provide in order to recover VAT. And that correspondence is at pages 393 to 421 of the bundle. And I'm...
And so, which bundle?
It's page 147 of Appendix 2.
Thank you.
I think 151, my lord. Apologies.
So is this the first voluntary disclosure?
This is the first voluntary disclosure of 15th September, and one sees that we want to make a voluntary disclosure. The amounts are enclosed claimed in the enclosed schedule. The figures were provided from our clients. We would like to claim interest. And then there's a very simple original claim which is made. Then at page 396, there's the business brief which was issued by the commissioners following TNT on the 15th of October 2009, which says, 3/4 of the way down, the commissioners are currently in discussions with Royal Mail to establish precisely which of their services will be affected, and further guidance will be issued once these discussions were complete. Then at page 397, which is page 155, one gets a follow-up letter from Mr. Ltd, who was acting on behalf of Zipvit, asking what progress is being made in entering a couple more schedules. And one sees that there is a further customs brief over leaf at 158, where the commissioners had set out what they were expecting people to produce as far as they possibly could for the purposes of claim handling. On the 27th of April, page 402, page 160, the officer asks for certain evidence from the representatives to support the claim. Evidence of the contractual arrangements between your client and Royal Mail, and evidence that input tax has been incurred, i.e. copies of the invoices. And at page 403, page 161, one sees that there has been a telephone conversation between Mr. Ltd and the officer. And he says, please find enclosed a typical sample of copy invoices that my client receives in respect to postal services. I'm unable to provide you with any written agreement because between my clients, as there is only really the invoices that reflect the agreement. But the services that have been negotiated are clearly listed in the copy invoices provided. And then there's a bit of a discussion as to whether or not these are individually negotiated services, and then one moves on with a number of the invoices as exemplars. Now, the initial decision letter is at page 415 of the electronic bundle, page 173 of the hard copy. And halfway down that page, one sees the reason why the officer rejects the claim. It's the Commissioner's understanding that Royal Mail's, including Parcel Force's contract terms, explicitly provide that charges made for supplies of postal services are exclusive of VAT, and that any VAT, if due, is to be paid on the top of the price quoted in the contract. In such cases, the Commissioners do not consider that customers can have valid claims for sums charged to them in the past by Royal Mail for supplies of postal services, including VAT. And then he goes on, from the information you have provided me with, I am of the opinion there is no reason to believe your client's contractual with Royal Mail differed in some respect from the norm. Furthermore, you've not been able to provide me with evidence that the price which your client was charged by Royal Mail included VAT. And then there's the usual indication that you can ask for a review or you can ask for an appeal to the tribunal. So that was the basis on which the officer rejected the claims, that these were VAT-exclusive supplies and you hadn't paid the VAT because the price that you paid did not include VAT, having regard to the invoices he'd seen. There's then a statutory review, which is at page 420, page 178 onwards. And the reviewing officer goes into a great deal more detail than the initial decision officer. But he says halfway down 179 why he's going to reject the claim. Page 421. I will take each of these issues in terms. No contract has been supplied to support this claim. HMRC would expect if there were an individually negotiated agreement, your client would have a copy. Our understanding that Royal Mail currently operates contractual terms providing for price exclusive of VAT. As you provided no evidence to demonstrate the price you paid to Royal Mail included VAT, it has been accepted your arrangement follows our perception. You have given no confirming information that your account terms amount to individually negotiated services. Mr. Maluti maintains the majority of the supplies are for mail media and parcel force, which under new rules would be taxable at the standard rate. Whilst acknowledging this is the case, has confirmed the details in the technical note, the descriptions of the invoices, with, for example, mail media and so on, without further details. It's not clear if those are mail media and would be liable for VAT at the standard rate. The remaining percentages of supplies from Royal Mail relate to other services, where we're not concerned about those at the moment. You have provided no evidence over the page that input tax is actually on these supplies. I acknowledge your representative has submitted some Royal Mail invoices. Well, that was part of the deal with the officer in question. But these quite rightly did not show VAT as being charged. One of those ways to corroborate you had been incurred input tax would be a contract to say you'd individually negotiated contract services and that was applicable. You do not appear to hold such a contract. Well, all that has really fallen away because it's accepted that these are mail media supplies which were indeed standard rated. And he says, further down, halfway down, in your situation you claim to have incurred input tax on the supply but given no evidence to support it. This is not the same. Then he says, there is no doubt the supply took place. The issue is whether you have incurred input tax. To date, you have provided no substantiating information to categorically confirm this was the case. And then he goes on about a particular tribunal authority that we don't have to worry about.
So this seems to be sort of mixed up to some degree with whether you could show that you had an individually negotiated agreement.
First half is this an individually negotiated agreement, which it's now accepted? It was.
Yeah, I wanted to just to ask you about that. You say it's now accepted. At what
Yes.
point did it come to be accepted that this was an individual?
The way in which the hearing before the first-tier tribunal proceeded was that whilst other supplies would be parked, the revenue were accepted that the mail media supplies which are the subject of the claim were indeed supplies which were standard rated in accordance with the TNT decision. So
So is it the start of the first-tier tribunal?
there or thereabouts.
Hearing.
I think it may have been even discussions between my learned friend and myself that we got to that point.
I see. Thank
But everything else has been parked, so we don't know yet whether or not other supplies would be treated as individually negotiated or otherwise within the scope of the TNT decision. But mail media, there is no objection to that point. So what is really left is the question of whether or not, in fact, these supplies should have been treated as supplies in relation to which Zipvit had incurred input tax, which is the issue in front of your lordship.
But presumably, evidence about the nature of the agreement would be necessary evidence before one knew whether one was dealing with an exempt supply or a standard rated supply.
One would certainly have required information as to which supplies had been identified, but you will have seen from the business brief that I referred you to earlier that the commissioners were addressing in detail with the Royal Mail precisely what their supplies had been and were, and how that would be carried forward in the future.
Just to help you, what was going through my mind was going back to the phraseology in some of the CJU cases where they talk about formal requirements being justified to the extent that, apart from that, conclusive evidence cannot be, is not being presented.
Yeah.
Until you had evidence of the nature of the agreements under which the services were supplied, you didn't, as I understand it, have conclusive evidence
Well,
as to what the VAT should have been.
that would make it very difficult as a general rule to claim input tax deduction, because all one will ever have from the Royal Mail is an invoice which shows mail media services.
Right.
That's the difficulty one has. Of course, the invoice
But that's,
is identifiable.
that's the difficulty,
Yeah.
isn't it, for the HMRC as well?
Well, yes, apart from the fact that HMRC and Royal Mail were themselves addressing that very issue at that very time in relation to the nature of the supplies which were being undertaken, had been undertaken by Royal Mail, who were in a much better position to provide HMRC with the relevant information relating to those particular activities.
Yes, thank you.
But given that that has gone by the board as far as mail media is concerned, it does appear that sooner or later the issue has been resolved. The last thing I need to deal with today, before I sit down, I hope, is the recent decision of Mr. Justice Mann in the RM Glow case.
There may be one other thing which the court would be assisted
Of course.
with your advice, and that is the question of a reference.
Yes, I do have.
You've got the text on that already.
I have not entirely forgotten. I was wondering whether the court would want to deal with that now or at the end of the hearing, but I can
Well, I
certainly...
can leave that up to counsel,
Yes,
but
yes.
it may be that the
Yes.
revenue would like to know your position on that when they speak.
Yes. Well, if I deal with the reference first, as far as the reference is concerned, our position is that the invoice issue, we say, has now authoritatively been dealt with by the decision of the Court of Justice in Verdun, and that the issue of whether the VAT is a separate and identifiable element from the taxable amount or merely part of the consideration is equally capable of being deduced from Goldsmiths and Chulaker and Elida Gibbs. When this case was in front of the Court of Appeal, the assumption of the parties was that there was nothing in the Royal Mail contracts, or at least that one could find in the Royal Mail contracts that were available to the parties, which made these supplies exclusive of VAT. So the oral argument and the submissions of the parties were all made on the basis that they were inclusive of VAT, or the matter was silent, or we simply didn't know. So the argument at that time before the Court of Appeal didn't really touch on Article 90 in the sort of detail that it has before your lordships today and my lady today. And nobody addressed the question of how Article 90 engaged in circumstances where the contract was VAT exclusive, but no further sum had ever been paid. Once Article 90 is properly considered, it's my submission that that then takes you back to Tulica, and Tulica gives you the answer that you require for the purposes of your lordship's and my lady's decision. And that you therefore have all that you require in order to answer this case, because the answers may clearly be deduced from the existing case law or are such as to admit of no reasonable doubt. That is
Thank you.
my reference argument anyway.
Right, so, well, that sounds like an argument. You say it's apt Claire.
Yes,
Yes.
we're fundamentally saying
And if we're against you on that, do you have anything to say about how a reference works or whether we should make one?
well, if it isn't Act Clare, then I would have to accept that your lordship and my lady would have to make a reference, being the final court.
Right. And how will that work?
There's still no difficulty.
After Brexit Day.
You still have power to make a reference after Brexit Day, and as my understanding is that the way in which the withdrawal amendment agreement operates is that during the transition, the implementation period up to the 31st of December, references can still be made. And if there are any outstanding references which haven't been put to bed by the Court of Justice by the 31st of December, there's a run-off period in which they can then deal and dispose of those cases in due course. And I think my learned friend and I are as one on that.
If you're at one, I wonder whether it might be possible to have an agreed note from you both about just the mechanics if we are being asked to make a reference, or you say we're obliged to make a reference at some point in the analysis.
Of course. I'm sure we can agree a note between us.
So there was one other case you
The RM Glow, I'm afraid, which is in the supplemental bundle again, tab 7, page 61. And the reference, the relevant passages are paragraphs 87 onwards, I think. The position in the group litigation is that Mr. Justice Mann has conducted that litigation and had directed that certain preliminary issues be addressed and argued back in July, I think. October, thank you. Amongst which was whether or not a customer can enforce the statutory right. Sorry, the customer can enforce the statutory obligation of his supplier to issue a VAT invoice to him. If I go and demand from Royal Mail that they give me a VAT invoice, do they have to do so, given that they have a statutory obligation to issue a VAT invoice where a taxable supply is made? The answer of Mr. Justice Mann has been no. A customer does not have an enforceable right to enforce that obligation against Royal Mail. And the reason he gives for that is really twofold. First, the commissioners were given power to accept alternative evidence to an invoice by Regulation 29(2). So there was an alternative method of obtaining input tax in the form of the discretion. And secondly, that this was not a case where you would expect an individual to have a right to enforce a breach of statutory duty, because there was an enforcement mechanism within the VAT Act, which was operable by the commissioners. And the argument of counsel for the claimants in that case therefore turned on the question of whether or not there was a discretion to vary the obligation, which is what's at paragraph 87. And Mr. Cordara for the taxpayer, for the claimant, was saying the discretion is not in practice available and is not available in the present case because Zipvit requires an applicant to prove that its supplier has paid the relevant VAT output tax, which he cannot do. So that goes back, as one then sees in paragraph 89, to a discussion by the learned judge of paragraphs 112 to 117 of the decision of Lord Justice Henderson in Zipvit. And then one sees that the words emphasised at the end of paragraph 89 are without producing evidence that the tax in question has been duly paid by the supplier. And what Mr. Justice Manns then is say, well, that shows that the taxpayer can't invite the exercise of a discretion to provide alternative evidence unless it can show the tax has been paid. Now, paragraph 91, Mr. Justice Mann says, no, Lord Justice Henderson wasn't going that far. He was delivering his judgment in a case in which it was apparent that the output tax had not been paid. That was highly likely to be the case where both parties had treated the supplier as exempt and the supplier did not change its mind. His express finding in paragraph 116. And then Overleaf, his reference to the need for evidence of payment of output tax by the supplier is made in that context. In my view, what he is saying is that where it is plain that originally the supplier did not account for output tax because no one thought it was payable, then HMRC was not obliged to accept some form of alternative evidence based on a recharacterization of the transaction, unless if it also produced evidence the situation had changed and the tax had in fact been paid. He was not laying down a general rule applicable to all circumstances in which an alternative case was sought to be made. And therefore, in paragraph 95, he rejects the submission.
Can you help me? Why wouldn't there be a contractual right to production?
He also discusses whether or not there was either an implied or an express term in the contract to provide a VAT invoice and decides that there wasn't.
Right.
I'm afraid. So all I want to do now is just to explain why I think that the learned judge was incorrect in what he said there, or rather on his interpretation of what was said by Lord Justice Henderson. First of all, I would say that in my submission, it's not a proper interpretation of what Lord Justice Henderson said. Secondly, it's not a reasonable outcome, given that it is another fundamental rule of EU jurisprudence that one is entitled to recover input tax whether or not the supplier has paid or accounted for the output tax. And it doesn't appear that the judge was taken to cases such as Bonnick, although he does accept in paragraph 92, a passage I didn't show you, but it's there, that generally speaking, a customer won't know whether or not the commissioners have been paid. In my submission, the decision of the Court of Appeal did go the extra step, which Mr. Cordara argued that they had. And having done that, they were in conflict with the EU principles of proportionality and neutrality. But matters wouldn't be any better if one accepted the interpretation advanced by Mr. Justice Mann, because it would still be necessary in a case where the supplier gets it wrong and fails to deliver an invoice and fails to pay the commissioners, why that should be reason enough to deny the customer the right to deduct. There is, in my submission, no EU authority which permits that analysis. And matters aren't improved by giving the commissioners a discretion as to whether or not to allow that claim. And in those circumstances, those are my submissions. And unless your lordship, my lady, have any further questions.
Bang on time, Mr. Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anyone, sorry, does anyone follow? No. Mr. Krasinski.
I'm going to start in a moment with a summary of our case on the due or paid issue. I'll then take you briefly back to the contractual documents, principally to address my Lord Briggs's question about what might be contractually due. I'll then go to the provisions of the directive and the case law of the Court of Justice on the due or paid issue. And then finally, because that's the logical way round, I'll deal with matters of domestic law, including under the VAT Act and the two domestic law cases which my learned friend relies upon. I'll then, probably some point late tomorrow morning, turn to the invoice issue. So can I start, please, with a summary of our case on the due or paid issue? 1. It is common ground that the substantive right to deduct input tax arises where VAT is, quotes, due or paid, close quotes, by the taxable customer to its supplier. See Article 168, little a, of the Principal VAT Directive, the PVD. Two, although the questions of whether VAT is chargeable on a supply and is payable, yes, I've been asked to move between two different microphones. Yeah, that's fine.
You have to be close to a microphone. It's not that we can't hear, but it's for recording. Thank you. So, although questions whether VAT is chargeable on a supply
and is payable by the supplier to the tax authority depend upon provisions of the directive and, of course, domestic legislation, the question of whether VAT has been paid by a taxable customer, so here Zipvit, to its supplier, so here Royal Mail, or is due so to be paid, is determined by the contract between them. In this case, sorry, that's 2. 3. In this case, the contract between Zipvit and Royal Mail was expressly stated to be exclusive of VAT, you've seen that already, with tax, if any, payable in addition to what I will call the principal sum that had been agreed for the value of the services supplied, the postal services. 4. At the time of the supply, Zipvit and Royal Mail considered it to be exempt from VAT, and Royal Mail did not charge Zipvit VAT. Instead, Zipvit was charged a sum for the value of the supply, and Zipvit paid only that sum. Five, following the Court of Justice decision in TNT, it is common ground that Zipvit did not pay any further sum to Royal Mail, and its appeal throughout these proceedings has assumed that no further sum is due to be paid to Royal Mail. Six, we're now getting to the meat of it. The effect of the judgment in TNT was not retrospectively to deem the original payments made by Zipvit, which were exclusive of VAT, to have been inclusive of VAT, thereby deeming VAT to have been paid by Zipvit.
Sorry, just to interrupt your flow a little bit. On your point 5,
Yes.
you say that Zipvit on its appeal has assumed that no further sum is due to be paid.
Yes.
I thought in answer to one of my questions, Mr. Thomas said that it would be open, I mean, subject to limitation and so on, it would be open to Royal Mail to charge Zipvit for the outstanding balance of the price in the sense of price,
I'll come
principal
back.
sum and
I'll
consideration.
come back to that, my lord.
And that there would then, if that happened, there would then be some adjustment under the regulations. I mean, by all means, come back to it, but I didn't want you just to go on assuming that I, at any rate, was accepting what you'd said in point 5.
Can I just draw my lord's attention to what the Court of Appeal said in paragraph 115 as the starting point to an answer to my lord's question? It's MS 170, which is in Core Bundle Tab 8, Internal 168. Lord Justice Henderson said, accurately, it needs to be remembered in this context that the amounts for which Zipvit is claiming a deduction have not been paid by Zipvit in response to a request by Royal Mail for payment once the taxable status of the supplies had been established. He goes on, in that situation, Royal Mail would have rendered an invoice showing the VAT due, and it would then have been liable to account to it to HMRC as output tax in the usual way. In those circumstances, there would have been no difficulty about Zipvit deducting the amount. All that actually has happened, however, is that Zipvit now wishes to treat the payments which it originally made to Royal Mail on the common understanding that the supplies were exempt as comprising an element of VAT and obtaining a deduction for that element on the strength of nothing more than the original payment. And so far as I can understand, though it's not, it's implicit in several of the passages in the judgment of Mr. Justice Mann, but not explicit. It has never been suggested either in this litigation or in the Glow litigation by either Zipvit or the claimants in that case that they want an invoice from Royal Mail that would compel them to pay any further sum at all to Royal Mail.
No, I'm sure they don't want it, but I thought that Mr. Thomas's analysis was the proper way of looking at the overall consideration is what you call the principal sum plus the VAT element. That's the overall consideration due for the supplies. There's been partial payment of only part of the total consideration. The submission, as I've understood it so far, is that Section 26A of the VAT Act means that one treats that partial consideration as being part principal sum and part VAT, all scaled down.
Yes.
Leaving over the possibility, I'm sure it hasn't happened, but the possibility that Royal Mail could issue a further invoice charging for the balance of the total consideration. And when that happens, if a further payment is made, again, there'll be scaling up of the VAT element, but you wouldn't treat that later payment as the totality of the VAT element. The VAT element would be spread across both those payments.
My lord, I understand that that is Millen and Friends' case, and I'll deal with
Right.
it, if I may, when I come to address, in detail, when I come to address those provisions of the VAT Act tomorrow.
Right. It's just that you put it to us that Zipvit in its appeal has assumed that no further sum is due to be paid. On that analysis,
Well,
it accepts that if a demand was made, and it may be time limited now, but at some relevant point in time, if a demand had been made, as I understand that analysis, a further sum would be due.
But there's a difference between whether Royal Mail ever had, post-TNT, the contractual right to demand an additional sum being paid? That's the first question. The second question is, did it ever exercise it? And if not, what were the consequences to Zipvit in terms of the due and paid formulation in Article 168A? And the position I will be shortly submitting is that in the absence of a demand from from Royal Mail to Zipvit, no further sum could be said to be due under the contract. And then finally, what the relevance of all of that is to Zipvit's right to input tax deduction.
Right, thank you.
Just returning then to the summary. So, paragraph 6, the effect of the judgment in TNT was not retrospectively to deem the original payments made by Zipvit, which were exclusive of VAT, to have been inclusive of VAT, thereby deeming VAT to have been paid by Zipvit. Such a conclusion would, in our submission, entail the following. A, it would entail allowing Zipvit to rewrite the contract unilaterally. B, it would entail ignoring the fact that it has been under no contractual obligation to pay any further sum, not having received a demand for that sum. C, it would, for the reasons I'll develop, be contrary to Articles 73 and 78A of the directive. And D, it would be inconsistent with the decisions of the Court of Justice in Tulica and the opinions of the Advocate General and the Court in the Volkswagen and BioSafe cases that we have not yet looked at. But put very simply, I hope not simplistically, the fact that TNT has decided that VAT should have been charged by Royal Mail and paid by Zipvit does not mean that it was so paid.
Well, it's not that Zipvit has decided. The law has indicated, has it not, that
TNT has decided,
TNT has decided.
that these supplies were not exempt.
So I thought you said Zipvit, but if you said TNT...
I meant to say, if I said Zipvit, that's a typo for TNT.
Maybe me. So, yes.
The fact that TNT decided that VAT should have been charged by Royal Mail and paid by Zipvit does not mean that it was so paid.
Yeah.
7.
Or due.
Or due. Well,
I thought
my lord,
yeah.
the due is a more complicated
Yeah.
position because it largely turns, for the reasons I've already explained, on the
I
contract.
understand. But the real point is, I mean, the real thrust of the submission against you is it's been paid.
I think that is the real thrust.
Yeah.
And for reasons I'll develop, it hasn't been. The fact that it shouldn't, the fact that it now know it should have been doesn't mean to say that it was.
Yeah.
7. Zipvit's case also conflicts with the principle that a taxable person cannot both take advantage of an exemption conferred in national law by not paying VAT at the time of the supply and also claim an input tax credit on the same supply. That's principle as established in several cases, including the cases of MDDP and VDP Dental, which I'll take you to. 8. Zipvit's case is also inconsistent with the Elida-Gibbs principle that a supplier of taxable services acts in VAT terms, I'm not talking about Bousted terms, as the collecting agent of the tax authority. Thus, where the supplier, here Royal Mail, is not subject to any enforceable obligation to collect VAT from its customer, Zipvit, and pay it to the tax authority, HMRC and has not taken any action to collect VAT from its customer, then the customer can't still assert that VAT is due from it.
And when you say enforceable obligation, at what point in time are you talking about? Because
I'm talking at all material times, and I'll develop a submission tomorrow.
Sorry, just on that.
Yes.
I mean, doesn't TNT tell us that what Royal Mail ought to have been doing was charging VAT and accounting for that to HMRC?
It does tell us that, my lord, but that doesn't equate to a enforceable legal obligation arising as between Royal Mail and HMRC. And I'll explain why that is tomorrow, but there's a pithy summary of the position in the decision of the first tier tribunal, Judge Mosedale. Can I just give you the reference? It's core bundle. Tab 8, page internal 211, MS 213. Paragraph 136 and 137. 136 says, the Court of Justice in the Velleclaire case, which I'll take you to, said there must be an enforceable tax claim. It's not enough to show that the supply was subject to VAT, as it wasn't enough in Velleclaire to show that the import was subject to VAT. There was no enforceable claim against Royal Mail. HMRC could only enforce against Royal Mail its liability to pay VAT on the mail media supplies in one of four situations. VAT was declared by Royal Mail in its VAT returns. It was not. VAT was later declared by Royal Mail in a voluntary disclosure of underpayment. It was not. Royal Mail issued an invoice. It did not. HMRC assessed Royal Mail to pay it. It did not. And Mr. Thomas says, well, HMRC should have assessed Royal Mail. And in short summary, our position is in circumstances where, well, I'll take you to the statement of HMRC's public position tomorrow, but the short answer is HMRC was not in a position consistent with the principles of legal certainty, stroke legitimate expectation, to raise any assessment against Royal Mail, because it had issued guidance on which everybody had relied for many years, saying postal services were not subject to VAT.
Of course, by due or paid, she meant due or paid by the
She
supplier
did,
to
and
HMRC.
with respect to her, she went wrong, and it's
Yeah,
common
so
ground.
there's a built-in error in the analysis.
There's an error in that anterior stage of the analysis, but I don't understand there to be any error in her identification in the bullet points of when there's an enforceable legal obligation. And then the ninth and final part of my summary, which again is compressed, is all the relevant provisions of domestic legislation, i.e. here the VAT Act and regulations, have to be interpreted in accordance with the directive and the case law of the Court of Justice interpreting it. In particular, section 19.2, which is intended to prescribe what could be called a ready reckoner formula for valuation purposes, in accordance with Articles 73 and 78A of the directive, does not displace all the conclusions of principle as a matter of EU law I have just mentioned. So that's all I want to say by way of summary at the outset. Can I then take you briefly to the contractual documents? The Court of Appeal held in paragraph 42 of its findings, from which there has been no appeal in terms of its evidential findings, that the contract between Royal Mail and Zipvit for the mail media bulk mail services were contained in 3 interlocking documents: a preface, a schedule, and some general T's and C's. They're all contained in Appendix Part 2. Can I take them in turn? The preface is at internal tab 8, page internal 141, MS 383. This preface lists the agreements for the provision of postal services between the Royal Mail Group, ... and the customer. The agreements are contained in this preface, that's the first thing, and in the attached general terms and conditions, that's MS 692 and following, and in the relevant schedules, that's MS 678 and following.
Can we ignore the user guides?
We can ignore the user guides, happily. So the schedule, which is at internal MS page 678, which for my Lord Sales is internal page 436.
Thank you.
Did you say 378 for the schedule?
No, internal 436, MS 678.
678. Thank you. Yeah.
Mail media schedule. So just looking at paragraph 1.1, this schedule sets out the obligations of the customer and Royal Mail in relation to mail media mailings and must be read with and subject to the Royal Mail bulk mail general T's and C's. And then turning over the page, please, to definitions. Postage towards the bottom of the page is defined as means the postage payable on mail media mailings as described in the schedule. The preface means the preface to the agreement. This agreement, that's at the bottom, means the agreement between Royal Mail and the customer relating to mail media and defined in the preface attached. Then over the page, please, MS 680, internal 438. 3.3, where Royal Mail has issued a booking acceptance, it shall accept that the mailing on the date specified in the booking as a mail media, provided that 3.3.1, the customer has signed and returned the booking acceptance, ... Next sentence. In so doing, the customer will have confirmed its agreement to pay the postage due for the mailing as shown on the booking acceptance in accordance with clause 6. Over the page, please, clause 6. 6.1, the customer shall pay postage for each mail media mailing as specified in the booking acceptance for each mailing. 6.3, please, Royal Mail may invoice the customer for sums due under clause 6.1, and the customer shall pay such invoices within 21 days. And then finally, please, page internal 450, MS 692, that is the bulk mail general terms and conditions which are incorporated. Paragraph 1.1.1 on MS 694, internal 452. This agreement means the agreement between Royal Mail and the customer relating to the services which comprises the preface, the terms and conditions contained in this document, and the relevant schedule. 1.1.4, postage means the amount payable by the customer to Royal Mail in respect of each posting. And then 3.1 over the page, which we've already looked at, the customer or Royal Mail shall calculate the postage in accordance with the relevant schedule, ... unless expressly stated otherwise in a schedule, all postage and other charges specified in each schedule as payable by the customer are exclusive of VAT. The customer shall pay any VAT due on postage and other charges at the appropriate rate in accordance with the payment provisions set out in the relevant appendix to these terms and conditions. And then the appendices are, as my learned friend rightly has pointed out, at MS 701, internal 459. And in broad terms, there are 4 appendices, all of which relate in some way or another, no doubt, to the creditworthiness of the customer. And then at 14, credit account, which my learned friend, I think, fairly says is likely to be the correct appendix, although this hasn't been explored until the Supreme Court. Royal Mail shall send to the customer weekly invoices showing the total charges due from the customer. So, to answer in that rather long-winded preface my Lord Briggs's question, insofar as the question needs to be answered, we would submit that until Royal Mail had sent an invoice to Zipvit seeking payment of an additional sum, no such sum was payable, or due within the meaning of Article 168A. That's what I want to say about the contract. Can I then please turn to the directive? And I'm going to start, please, with Articles 73 and 78A. That's in the core volume, sorry, not in the primary authorities volume, tab 12, MS 887. Could I just ask the court to reread to itself, I won't read it out, all of Article 73 and 78A. So, in our submission, reading those two together, the taxable amount, which is the phrase used in line 2 of Article 73, equates to the value of the supply and excludes VAT. We see that from 78A. Thus, the taxable amount is an amount independent of any VAT and independent of whether VAT is added or not added. In our submission, nothing in these provisions supports an analysis inherent in Zipvit's case by which the taxable amount paid under the contract in return for the value of the supply will change depending on, for example, whether there's a decision of the Court of Justice deciding that the supply is subject to VAT rather than exempt.
But what if the parties had a common but incorrect assumption as to the law as it had already been declared to be and constructed the contract on that basis? I mean, the point you're making is a subsequent, what you call a subsequent change in the law.
Yes.
Whether it really is subsequent or not might be a matter about which the Court of Justice would have some issue with you.
Well, I'll answer my Lord's question. Can I answer my Lord's question after? With respect? I've taken you to the case law because it answers my Lord's question. Can I just say one other thing before I move away from Article 73 and 78A? And it is that there is a perhaps unfortunate mismatch of language between Article 73/78A on the one hand and Section 19(2) on the other, in the way in which the word consideration is used. I won't develop that submission now because I'm going to deal in more detail with how Section 19 operates tomorrow, but they don't use the words consideration in the same way. But rather than deal with the domestic legislation and case law, I'm now going to turn to the Court of Justice cases, starting, please, with Tulica. Tulica, you will recall, was the case where the two individuals, Mr. Tulica and Miss Plaversin, entered into lots of contracts for the sale of land over many years and failed to charge VAT when they should have done. So a scenario, I think, not unlike the one that my Lord has just posed. And the question was whether the amounts paid to them under the contract should have been regarded as VAT inclusive, in which case the tax authority could only assess them for the embedded amount. Tulica is at tab 25 of the core, the primary authorities bundle. Just to indicate what our submission is on it before I take you to the relevant passage, our submission is that Tulica clearly indicates that where national law, including, of course, the law of contract, permits the supplier to charge and recover VAT in addition to the amount that has been paid, then the taxable amount under Articles 73 and 78A, i.e. the value of the supply, is the principal sum, the basic price, and VAT is to be assessed on top of that basic price. So if the price agreed is £100 and the contract allows the supplier to charge and recover VAT on top, if it turns out that the supply is taxable, then VAT will be assessed on the supplier by the taxing authority at £20, assuming a 20% rate. It is not authority for the proposition in paragraphs 41 and 42 of my learned friend's case. Can we just please turn that up? My learned friend's written case, core volume tab 6, paras 41 and 42. Page MS 84, internal 82. Having cited Article 73 and 78A, my learned friend refers at the bottom of the page 80, MS 84, to the Tulica decision. He then cites paragraphs 34 to 36 of the Court of Justice's decision, and at the risk of making a forensic point, tellingly omits the key passage, paragraph 37, before moving swiftly on to asserting that the reasoning of the Court of Justice was that even though the supply had been treated as a supply in respect of which no VAT was chargeable, when the consideration was properly analysed, it had to be treated as consisting partly of the principal sum and partly as an amount of VAT. But as I say, even though he cites only 34 to 36 there and only 34 to 36 in 42, he omits the key passage in Tulica at paragraph 37. And the key passage in paragraph 37 says in terms, well, can we start perhaps a little bit further up the page?
Reference?
MS 957, Primary Authorities, tab 25, internal page 98. As I think my Lady Black observed in the course of argument this morning, we see from paragraph 28 that the evidence before the court, second sentence of paragraph 28, says the file also shows that the parties of the contract at issue in the main proceedings made no provision in regard to VAT when they fixed the price of the immovable property, which was the subject matter of the sale. No information has been provided by the referring court as to whether or not under national law a means is available to those suppliers of recovering from the purchasers, in addition to the agreed price, the VAT now being claimed by the tax authorities. For example, if national law had provisions concerning the implication of terms, as our national law does. Moving down, please, paragraph 32, last sentence. Article 78 provides that VAT is not to be included in the taxable amount. Paragraph 33, in accordance to the general rule, the taxable amount for the supply of goods or services for the consideration is the consideration actually received for them by the taxable person, i.e. excluding the VAT. Then, paragraph 35, where a contract has been concluded without reference to VAT in a situation where the supplier has no means in national law of recovering from the purchase of the VAT claimed subsequently. So those are important words that get repeated in paragraph 37 and repeated in paragraph 43. Taking the total price without deducting the VAT as the taxable amount on which VAT is to be levied leads to a situation where it is the supplier which bears the VAT burden, conflicting with the principle that VAT is a tax on consumption to be borne by the end consumer. Taking that amount as the taxable amount also conflicts with the rule that the tax authorities may not charge VAT on an amount exceeding the amount paid by the, and we know it means, final consumer. The situation is otherwise when the supplier has the possibility under national law of adding to the agreed price a supplement equal to the tax applicable to the transaction and recovering it from the purchaser of the goods. I confess, not entirely to understand what Mr. Thomas's case is about this paragraph. I think at one point he seemed to be saying that a supplement could in some way be interpreted as meaning a supplement within the amount. In other words, a supplement doesn't actually mean an additional sum at all, but somehow means carving out some kind of embedded tax. That plainly cannot be what the Court of Justice meant. The Court of Appeal, Lord Justice Henderson, was inclined to agree with our interpretation of Tulica. Can I show my lords and my lady what the Court of Appeal said? On this, 4-volume, tab 8, paragraphs 68 to 70, MS 155 to 156. So having cited Tulica, Lord Justice Henderson says at the bottom of paragraph 68, the only exception would be if, as a matter of contract, the vendors were able to pass on to the purchasers the amount of VAT and to recover it from them, because in those circumstances the tax would still end up being paid by the end consumer. Where the exception applies, the question then arises whether the original price should still be treated as partly composed of VAT, that's Mr. Thomas's case, and whether the supplement equal to the tax applicable to the transaction which is recovered from the purchaser should be treated in the same way, or whether the transaction should now be analysed as consisting of an original payment exclusive of VAT, followed by a payment which in its entirety represents the tax. That question wasn't considered by the court, but in my view it is at least arguably implicit, and we go further and say clear in its reasoning, that the treatment of the original price as VAT inclusive is only necessary if VAT on the whole of the original price can't subsequently be recovered from the purchaser. It's a matter for national law to determine whether the supplier can recover VAT from the purchaser in this way, but if he can, there is no explicit support in the court's judgment for the proposition that it remains necessary to treat the original price as having included an element of VAT at the rate applicable to the transaction as a whole. Furthermore, if the tax can be recovered in this way, the taxable amount will be larger than if the original price has to be treated as VAT inclusive, because the recoverable supplement will represent VAT on the whole of the original price. And then paragraph 17, in summary, Tulica provides solid support for Zipvit's case to the extent it recognises the need for a retrospective dissection for a supply which turns out to be taxable, but only in a situation where the supplier is unable to recover the tax from the customer as a matter of national law. The case provides no explicit guidance on the correct analysis in cases where recovery of the tax is possible, but arguably proceeds, and we say clearly proceeds, on the assumption that no retrospective dissection is then called for, and that the transaction should be then analysed as a single one based on a taxable amount equal to the original price, with VAT being invoiced and paid separately. And as you've just heard, our submission that is the clear implication, and it becomes clearer still when we look at a trio of cases, none of which Milena Friend took you to. The first is a case called T-Mobile.
Sorry, just before you move on, what do you say happens where the supplier chooses not to call in the VAT element supplement that you're talking about?
Then there is no further amount payable by the due, in the language of Article 68, by the customer to the supplier. It's not been paid because it's not embedded in the original price, and it's not due because we know from the case I'm about to take you to, or the three cases I'm about to take you to, that due means due from the customer to the supplier under the contract.
That Lord Justice Henderson in paragraph 69 talks about a transaction at the top of the paragraph, which should be analysed as consisting of an original payment exclusive of VAT, followed by payment which in its entirety represents the tax. Whereas we're dealing with a situation where that second element doesn't happen.
I understand that, my lord.
Mr. Brzezinski, is there a possible distinction between provisions which enable you to quantify the VAT element in any contractual arrangement for payment for the supply, and provisions which enable you to understand where there has been a payment in fact, whether that payment can be treated as including or not including an amount of VAT? Because it doesn't seem to me necessarily to follow that in a case where one may conclude from a right to recover VAT, if any, on top of the agreed price, on a mistaken assumption that it's exempt, that necessarily it follows that a payment of a sum of money but for the supply is to be treated as not including any element for VAT. Quantification is one thing, but dissecting the payment made to understand whether it's got VAT in it may be something different.
Well, I certainly accept that for what I call before the ready reckoner provisions of Section 19 of the VAT Act, which are about quantification, don't drive the result about whether somebody is entitled to input tax or not. That far I would agree with my lord. I don't know if my lord is going further than that.
Well, I think I'm saying that I'm understanding your submission at this early stage, and I realise you haven't fully developed it, as meaning that if you're right that in a case where the supplier can charge VAT on top of the price,
Yes.
Tulica leaves open an analysis which treats the taxable amount as the price plus the VAT.
Yes.
It necessarily follows that if the party is thinking that no VAT is due, just pay the price, no VAT element has actually been paid.
Yes. That is my submission.
Yes, well, I'm simply raising a flag to ask whether the one really follows necessarily from the other.
And the answer will be... I haven't got time. Can I show my lord the answer that the Court of Justice has given tomorrow?
Sure.
Can I leave you with one... It'll take me less than 2 minutes, one last case before we go, because the two cases of Volkswagen and BioSafe are very important to this analysis, and they'll take a little bit of time to unpack. What will take much less time to unpack is a case called T-Mobile, which is at Primary Authorities tab 33. In a nutshell, the case concerned whether very... Oh, sorry, MS 1081.
1081. Thank you.
The case concerned whether very large payments of money made by Austrian mobile telephone companies to the national regulator in return for 3G telecommunications licenses were subject to VAT at all. That was the big question. And then if so, whether the payments which had already been made were included VAT, had embedded VAT, or were payments to which VAT would still have to be added. So you can see the second question is obviously the more relevant for our present purposes. And the answer given by Advocate General Cockott and we'll see her name crop up again and again in these cases, can be found at paragraphs 143 to 145. By this question, we're referring
page?
MS 116. So, but by this stage of her analysis, she has concluded, as the court went on to conclude, that these were not taxable supplies in the first place. They weren't economic activity. Granting telecommunications licenses by a public authority wasn't a vatable transaction. So we're now into obiter territory. But at 143 to 145, she said, by this question, the referring court asks whether under the directive, the payments are to be construed as gross or net. That is to say, whether the agreed payments already include VAT or are payments to which VAT may still be added. As it's already been established that the allocation is not a transaction subject to VAT, there's no need to answer this question. Quite apart from this, the sixth directive does not contain any provisions on this point. Whether or not a payment includes VAT all depends on what the parties actually agreed. If this should not be clear, the content of their agreement has to be ascertained according to the rules of interpretation applicable under national law, for which it is for the courts of the member states alone to determine. And I think I've now gone past my time.
That's indeed a convenient place to stop. Thank you very much. We'll resume tomorrow morning at 10:15. Thank you.